thousands of people start dreaming about a man who's haunted by his own mediocrity. This event gives him the fame he wants, only for the dreams and his waking life to turn into nightmares. Sophie is in the yard with her father Paul when a set of car keys falls from the sky, shattering the glass table. This baffles her, but her father doesn't seem to mind. More objects fall, and Sophie suddenly floats. She begs for help, but her father just watches. She recounts this dream during breakfast with Paul and her mother Janet, mentioning that she had the same one thrice now. Paul is bothered by how passive he was in the dream and assures his daughter that he's more caring than that. Their older daughter, Hannah, passes by on her way out, but her parents remind her to babysit Sophie while he and Janet go out tonight. As Paul prepares for work later, Janet asks if he feels nervous about confronting his former colleague, Sheila, later. He thinks it'll work out, but she asks him to record the woman's reaction. The man nervously chuckles at this before leaving. Later, Paul teaches a class when two students start murmuring amongst themselves. He calls them out before proceeding with the lesson. After classes, he heads to a restaurant to meet Sheila, but the receptionist pauses as she recognizes him but can't remember where she saw him before. The man then waits for his friend and discreetly starts recording on his phone as his wife instructed. Eventually, Sheila arrives and awkwardly comments how different he looks while gesturing to his entire body. They catch up and Paul brings up the research paper she's about to publish, wondering why he's not being credited in it. He reminds her that he came up with the theory back in grad school but she wasn't interested in it at the time. Now she's about to publish the same research while he's writing about it as well. Confused, Sheila asks for a draft of the book, but he admits that he hasn't written anything. Instead, he begs her to credit him just so he can be more relevant, but Sheila denies him. As Paul listens to the recording and laments on how pathetic he sounded, embarrassed, he deletes it. While waiting for his wife at the theater, Paul notices a man staring at him. Soon, Janet arrives and asks how his confrontation with Sheila went. He lies that she saw his argument but hasn't resolved it. She asks if he recorded it and he says he didn't because it felt unethical. During the show, Paul remains distracted by his failure. When they step out of the theater later, one of his exes, Claire, approaches Paul, mentioning that she's been thinking of him since he keeps appearing in her dreams. She describes that, despite her awful dream of losing her friend, Paul was just standing there. The man looks offended and wonders why he doesn't help out in the dream. Claire notices his reaction and assumes that he's looking for the insult in her words like he always did. She explains that her therapist suggested she reach out to him to help with her dream issues. With that idea, she asks him out to coffee. Paul agrees and Janet just rolls her eyes as the two exchange numbers. When they prepare for bed later, Janet confronts her husband about him getting flustered around Claire. Paul argues that it's normal to be that way around an ex, so his wife admits that she's worried. With that, Paul assures her that he'll only meet Claire for coffee. Paul soon meets with Claire, and the woman asks his permission to write about her strange dreams in the online magazine she works for. He agrees and jokes that she shouldn't portray him as an inadequate loser like in the dreams. He then brings up that his wife suspected that she still has feelings for him. Claire laughs at the idea before excusing herself to leave. Her reaction leaves Paul disappointed. The next day in class, Paul overhears two students discussing their dreams about him. Bothered, he heads to his friend and school dean Brett and asks if he dreamed about him. The confused dean says no and Paul leaves. During dinner that night, he gets a call from an old college friend Richard who mentions how his wife Carlotta and another friend shared that they both had dreams with Paul in it. The idea stuns the professor, and the shock of multiple people dreaming of him causes him to faint. Later, Paul checks his social media to find it flooded with people asking why he's in their dreams. He tells Janet that Claire's article must have directed people to his profile, and now a news outlet wants to interview him. Janet is anxious at his excitement about this and tells him not to do anything drastic. Despite her advice, he agrees to the interview and soon gets a segment on the news. This gains him popularity at school where his students are eager to ask him questions. With this in mind, Paul diverts the lesson to discuss their specific dreams. In all their dreams, Paul merely observes their tense situations. This makes the professor pause, but he continues the discussion anyway and revels in the attention. His sudden fame also leads to his daughters regarding him better, with Sophie asking him to drive her to school. Janet's career also takes a positive turn when her coworker, Chris, is also starstruck about her husband's fame. She uses this to her advantage and lands a position at a museum project. Janet shares the good news to Paul that night, and her husband also mentions that Richard finally invited them to his famous dinner parties. Even with the positive air between them, Janet asks why he's not in her dreams. He humors her and asks what kind of dream she wants. She requests him to save her from danger while wearing the wide-shouldered suit he wore for Halloween. He comments on how simple her request is, so she jokes about seeing him on horseback instead. After the couple goes to sleep, a mysterious man enters their home and gets a knife from the kitchen. The intruder goes to the bedroom and announces that he has to kill Paul. This wakes the couple up, so the husband springs up while the frightened Janet calls the police. With the family cornering him, the intruder sinks to the floor and breaks down, repeatedly claiming that he has to kill Paul. An investigator speaks to the family the next morning, saying how the intruder had manic episodes and didn't take his medications. He advises them to get security in their house, given that unwanted visitors are a common side effect of fame. Frightened by this, Janet asks her husband to stay low for now. Paul doesn't agree with this and rants about the event to Brett later. The dean, however, agrees with his wife. Paul debates that his appearance in people's dreams means something and the intruder might be a one-time thing. The professor is tired of his mediocrity, so he believes this event will make him stand out and get his book published. With that in mind, he soon goes to an agency where the assistant, Molly, leads him to the elevator. There, she chuckles to finally meet the man from her dreams. She then leads him to Trent, the head of the agency, who explains that their company pairs brands and odd celebrities. Using this opening, the professor mentions about publishing his book, but Trent pitches about him endorsing a soft drink to cause people to dream about him with a product. Paul refuses, saying that he wants to be known as a biologist, not an endorser. With that, they brainstorm further, saying they can have the president dream of him so they can be inserted in the political audience. Again, the professor rejects this and declares that their partnership isn't working out. Desperate, Trent promises to support his book, but the professor has to keep an open mind about their ideas. After the meeting, Molly escorts him to the elevator and invites him for drinks sometime later. The man retreats to his hotel room afterward, where he calls his wife, lying about how great the meeting was and how they regarded him as the most interesting person in the world. Janet comments how flattering it sounds, but Paul insists that they didn't say that just to flatter him, somehow finding the insult in her comment. Then, he overhears another voice on the line, making him suspicious. Janet assures him that it's just Chris, who came over to work on their project. Their daughters are out trick-or-treating, leaving his wife alone with her coworker at home. This clearly bothers Paul. He tries to get her attention by mentioning how the agency is planning to make the president dream of him, but Janet sweetly says he doesn't need to impress her. With that, they end the call. Feeling inadequate, he agrees to go out with Molly. Molly recalls that she had a dream about him, so hesitantly, the woman reveals how she dreams about having intense lovemaking with him. She describes how it's always her sitting in the living room and Paul approaching her wordlessly before the dream turns passionate. Paul is excited to finally hear about a dream where he isn't passive. As the night goes on, Molly notices people taking photos of him. Scared that rumors can start, he decides to leave, and to his surprise, Molly invites him to her apartment. They sit on the couch to relax, but Molly can't resist and indirectly asks him to reenact her dream. With this, she changes clothes and tells Paul to stand on a corner. Paul starts approaching her and she acts vulnerable. She then instructs him to take the lead like in her dreams, but he gets nervous. Because of this, Molly takes the initiative, but the sheer tension makes Paul finish instantly. Disappointed with himself yet again, he storms out, leaving Molly confused. While Paul struggles to sleep in his hotel, Sophie dreams about her father barging in and manically stomping toward her, scaring her awake. Sometime later, Paul cusses in his home and he sees a newspaper headline about Sheila's groundbreaking research that he doesn't get credit for. His breakdown scares Sophie away. Elsewhere, one of his students dreams about Paul strangling her. Another guy has a nightmare where Paul bludgeons him. The next day, Paul arrives in class to find most of his students gone. Brett reveals that students started getting violent and explicit dreams of him. Paul argues that they're only dreams and he hasn't done anything, but Brett explains that he has to listen to both sides, so he suggests getting HR involved. On the evening of Richard's dinner party, the host welcomes Paul and Molly but reveals that nobody else came. During dinner, Carlotta remains anxious around Paul and suddenly excuses herself to leave. Once she's gone, Richard explains that she had brutal nightmares about Paul and wanted to cancel the dinner since she wasn't comfortable to be around him. This is also the reason why no one else attended, so Richard urges the couple to leave. Eventually, a school counselor encourages a group of students to gradually expose them to Paul to help deal with their trauma. She insists that Paul is harmless despite the dreams. With this in mind, she signals Paul to enter the room. However, the moment he speaks, the students walk out. Defeated, he walks out but finds his car vandalized. He yells at the students but they instead record him and heckle at him. During dinner, Paul announces that the school suspended him for the sake of the students so he'll focus on his book. Hannah asks what he did to cause the nightmares, saying that thousands of people are tweeting about it. Days later, Chris tells Janet she's out of the museum project since they don't want the nightmare scandal affecting it. The woman has no choice but to accept this. That night, Sophie tells her father that her classmates tease her about him. He tries to explain that it's not his fault, though his daughter doesn't seem convinced. Making matters worse, Janet becomes suspicious about Molly, who's been texting her husband. Paul explains that she's the assistant in the agency, but Janet dryly says he never mentioned her. Paul spends his days alone and his friends don't want to talk to him. The internet also focuses on his appearance in nightmares and his meltdown at school. He soon attends an online meeting with the agency who tells him that despite the negative attention, anti-establishment parties are interested in him. However, the professor doesn't want controversy. Trent asks him to reconsider and mentions that he's somehow famous in France. To get some air, Paul eats at a restaurant, but a waitress asks him to leave because everyone else is uncomfortable with him around. He argues that he hasn't broken any rules, so the helpless waitress leaves him alone. Instead, a burly man approaches him and calmly tells him to leave. When he refuses, the man spits on his food. Frustrated, he grabs his food and throws it at the man. This leads to Janet driving to the hospital to pick her husband up after he got beaten up. Seeing his anguish, the wife suggests doing a public apology to appease the people. Paul refuses, but she insists on doing it for their family. Given that she almost lost her job, Sophie's getting teased, and Hannah is depressed. Paul still refuses because he doesn't want their attackers to win. Janet asks if he wants his family to be miserable, and he cusses at her, leading him to sleep on the couch that night. In his sleep, he dreams about being hunted, only to find that his hunter is himself. The other Paul then aims a crossbow at him and ends him. The next day, the teacher in Sophie's school informs Paul that he's not invited to the play. He asserts his right to be there, but the teacher reasons that many kids will feel unsafe. Janet tells him to agree to it, but he whines that she's never on his side. With no choice, Paul records himself and apologizes to the masses, mentioning that he himself had similar nightmares, hoping this will make him sound empathetic. He spirals down to how miserable his life is and how he is the biggest victim of all. His family takes this negatively, and Janet tells him how insincere and self-serving the apology was. Feeling like his family has abandoned him, Paul decides to stay with Brett for a few days. However, he ends up in the basement since Brett's wife doesn't want to see him. On the day of Sophie's play, Paul decides to walk into the school and begs to see his daughter. The teacher rejects him and closes the door. The man tries to pull the door back, but this leads to the teacher crushing her hand. The woman exclaims that Paul attacked her, while the man shouts that it was an accident, defending that he just wants to see his daughter. Within the seats, Janet and Hannah watch in embarrassment, and Sophie cries on stage as several men pin her father down. Months later, an advertisement announces that after the incident at the school, people stopped dreaming about Paul. The ad then introduces a gadget called the Norio, which allows people to enter other dreams. This also allows a group of influencers to do advertisements in dreams. Eventually, Paul and his daughters view a new house he's planning to buy after his separation from Janet. As his daughters check the bedrooms, their agent asks Paul how the nightmare stopped, but he doesn't know. He drives his daughters home afterward, though he asks if Chris visits the house. They say yes, but dodge further questions before exiting the car. Janet meets her ex-husband outside and asks how the new house is. He comments that Sophie wants him to move back in, but she dismisses the idea. He then asks if she dreams of him, and instead of answering, she wonders why he keeps asking that question. This time, he dodges the question and mentions that he has to leave for France for his tour. He imagines doing a heartfelt farewell with her, but instead, Janet dryly says she'll see him when he returns. One night, Paul dreams about preparing for bed when an influencer appears to promote some shoes. He tries to punch the guy, but his blows feel like jelly. Just then, another influencer appears to advertise some supplements. Paul wakes up from the dream in his hotel room in France, where he wears the Norio on his arm. That morning, he has a photo shoot for his book cover, but the staff hands him a bladed gauntlet to wear. Despite his hesitation, the ex-professor poses with the item. Soon, he attends his book signing and marvels at the people in the venue. To his disappointment, the shop owner reveals that there was a conflict of schedule. The audience at the shop isn't for him, and he has to do his signing in a dingy room downstairs. This leads to Paul finally seeing a copy of his book, but finds it thin. The title's also been changed from Dream Scenario to I Am Your Nightmare. With nothing else going his way, he accepts it and continues with the signing. His bad luck continues when the light above him breaks and hits his head. Defeated and alone, Paul thinks of his wife in his hotel room. Desperate, he watches a Norio instructional video to allow him to enter Janet's dream. He gives her the scenario she wanted, where he saves her while wearing the wide-shouldered suit. Afterward, he walks with her through the streets and comments that he wishes this was real. However, he floats away, having achieved the relevance he wanted but lost everything else along the way. Subscribe to watch more videos like this, turn on notifications, and leave a like to help the channel out. Thank you for watching.